Hello, friends. Welcome to our Covenant Project Town Hall meeting. We are so glad that you have taken the opportunity and the time together with us in this space. As we start our time together, I'd like to lead us in a word of prayer. Please be in prayer with me. We breathe in God's grace. May it transform our insecurities so that we breathe out God's love. We breathe out God's love. May it transform our fears so that we breathe out God's hope. We breathe in God's hope. May it transform our doubts so that we breathe out God's faithfulness. We breathe in God's faithfulness. May it transform our hearts so that we breathe out the good news of Christ Jesus. We breathe in the good news of Christ Jesus. May it transform us so that we breathe out God's grace. We breathe in God's grace. May it transform our insecurities so that we breathe out God's love. Amen. Thank you all for joining us for this Covenant Project conversation. We are here to talk about how we do church in a new time and place. Today we are gathered with the Reverend Bill Rosheim and the Reverend Terry Hord Owens, and we will walk through some of the proposed changes to the design for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. These proposed changes we will present at the 2023 General Assembly in Louisville, Kentucky. But we want you to know what you will have an opportunity to vote on in that assembly. So I'm going to turn it over to Reverend Bill Rosheim to introduce himself and to begin our conversation.
Thank you, Reverend Dr. Belva Brown Jordan. And we sure appreciate your leadership as moderator for the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and helping us to get this project underway. We've been very fortunate to be able to have this conversation with congregational leaders, with regional leaders, chaplains, general church ministry representatives, general ministries, laity and clergy alike, ecumenical ministries, and higher education representatives. And so we're really glad that you're here today. Our primary purpose for today is to provide the why. Why are these proposed changes being made? Offer some clarity about the major changes. We'd like to also help consider the benefits of our shared work as covenant people and gather input from people like you to help us make any needed improvements to the proposals that are about to be shared with the General Board and from the General Board to the General Assembly in July of 2023. Reverend Terry Hord Owens, our General Minister and President, is about to give us some background about how this process came to be. Terry, what's the story?
Thank you so much, Bill, and also Belva. It's actually an exciting story. This is a process that has taken some time. We first began meeting as the Governance Committee really in April 2018, trying to better understand how we could take the lessons learned from the Mission First Project for the betterment of the church. That resulted in a planned retreat in September of 2019 in the desert at Arizona, where we gathered to do Bible study and prayer and to share thoughts and ideas. And the one word that kept coming to us in our prayer time, in our Bible study time, and in our conversation, the Holy Spirit kept saying covenant, learning how to remind ourselves that we are indeed a church that tries to live a covenantal life. From that retreat came the idea for a covenant education curriculum. We had already sort of done a test drive, if you will, through small group discussion with the General Board that began in February of 2020, right before the pandemic hit. we heard from the speakers who eventually became some of the lecturers in our covenant education curriculum, which you can find online, called Covenant Conversations. And that information was shared and put together in a 6-week online curriculum. And from February rather, of 2020, every year during our annual general board meeting, we have been holding these conversations in small groups. As more meat was put on the bones around the concepts of what we were talking about, we shared that with the general board. We've been having conversations with regional ministers, with the leaders of our general cabinet ministries. So through April of 2021, October of 2021, as we've had a general board meeting and then administrative committee meeting in the fall, we've continued to share these thoughts and ideas and get feedback as we've had in our sights the goal of bringing something to the church at the 2023 General Assembly in Louisville. And so we just, this past October, presented a draft of revised changes to the design document in the areas of the General Board, General Assembly, and the Administrative Committee. And so we actually talked the Administrative Committee through the language that reflected some of these proposed changes. As you know, we've had over 25, I think 27 Covenant Project town halls with groups across the church, including some student groups at some of our divinity houses, schools of theology. We've met with regional clergy in certain regions. We've met with the executive staff of one of our general ministries, as well as other leaders of our general ministries. So this has been a process of continuing feedback and growth and refinement. And once we understood that we needed to ground this work in a theological understanding of what it means to be a church in covenant, then we better understood that we needed then to place all of the changes that we're proposing into that context of what does it mean to be a church that better lives into its understanding of itself as a covenant church. So I'm really excited that we're at this point where we're not only talking concepts, but going forward, the General Board will actually be looking at some definitive language to propose for the General Assembly in July of 2023.
Thank you, Terry, and thank you, Bill. The next part of our time together, we want to review some of the major proposed changes. They are exist in two particular areas, and one has to do with the General Assembly, and the other is with the General Board. I'm going to talk a little bit about the General Assembly, and then I'm going to invite Bill to share about proposed changes for the General Board. As you know, presently the General Assembly meets every 2 years. We are talking about moving to a 3-year cycle where we would meet in person every 3 years, but in between those years, we would have opportunities to gather and to meet in some hybrid format. And we're still working out exactly what that looks like, but the idea is that we would be able to meet more frequently and working on the technology to make it possible for us to do that. We've also talked about having 3 congregational delegates. That's 3 delegates from each congregation. There's been some conversation about, well, if you have a larger congregation or a smaller congregation, are you still talking about the same number of delegates? And we're saying yes. The proposal is talking about 3 delegates from each congregation. And that in those in-between gatherings that I talked about, in between those 3 years of meeting, those delegates will have an opportunity to meet. So in essence, it's like the General Assembly is perpetually in a call into being and in order because of those delegates being able to meet in between the every 3-year cycle that we are talking about. And by having 3 delegates from every congregation, it's going to give us more people to be in conversation with. In those in between times, there'll be times for education and prayer and discussion, and particularly to help people prepare for that meeting that's going to happen every 3 years, where votes will be taken on resolutions or other issues. And so we're looking at changing the format and the frequency of General Assembly and having more delegates to help us engage and know what's on the minds and hearts of disciples across the denomination. Bill, can you say a little bit more about the General Board and the changes we're proposing there?
Sure. Thank you, Velva. Yeah, we're hoping that the General Board has a new size, a smaller size, that will allow it to work more effectively and quickly as a working board on the missional priorities for the church. I'm sure many of us can remember congregational meetings where we may have been in a congregation that was a fairly good size, and we would have the annual congregational meeting. And we know how much work goes into trying to make those things work within a certain period of time. Our general board, by being a smaller size, has an opportunity to really dive deeper and to do better work, we think, on the issues that are of primary importance to the church and how we show up in the world in this new era. We're going to be receiving those priorities from delegates to the board. And those delegates, those congregational delegates who've been gathering for dialogue and discernment through these more frequent iterations of the General Assembly, those are going to shape the board priorities. And I'd like to ask our General Minister and President Terry, would you walk us through how we make decisions now and how that might change with a different General Assembly board configuration?
Thanks, Bill. Currently, each congregation sends a minimum of 2 delegates to our biennial every 2-year General Assemblies, and we have a system by which the number of those delegates is prorated up based on the size of the congregation. But our General Board actually meets every year, and there are currently about 117 people on that board. That includes our regional ministers who are ex officio with voice but no vote, and the presidents of our general ministries who are also ex officio with voice but no vote. The administrative committee, which is about 20 people currently, meets in the fall in October, and during that time, most of their work is comprised of serving as the board for the office of the general minister and president, as well as what you would think of as the executive committee of the general board. And then they meet again in the spring, February or April, before the general board. There isn't really a good opportunity for congregational ideas to go directly to the general board under that system. And we are usually asking for input in the form of resolutions in terms of how congregations and other groups can get items on the business docket of the General Assembly. Under the new system, each congregation would have 3 delegates. There is some discussion about whether 3 is enough for larger congregations. There is some concern about whether congregations, if they can't find 3 people, the idea is that we want equity across all of our congregations. But those congregational delegates would be meeting virtually and perhaps asynchronously, meaning we wouldn't necessarily have to have all of those delegates meeting together all of the time, because they won't be meeting just to vote. They will be meeting in order to listen, hear new ideas, learn more about those ideas from one another, engage in dialogue and conversation that may create a need to vote on one matter or another in between those 3-year periods. In today's system, if a matter arose from which the church or on which the church would need to speak, we can't do that unless we officially have a General Assembly. But as Belva said earlier, the General Assembly under the new system could perpetually always be in session or be called into session in order to vote. Each of those delegates would serve a 3-year term. So we're moving from a system that's pretty linear, and there's a longer distance between a congregational involvement directly to the general board to a system where delegates would always be meeting and discussing as often as they felt necessary, as often as leadership of the church felt necessary. And there would be a way to feed those ideas and priorities directly to the general board as the general board does its work to set missional priorities for the church, to consider how to finance the work of the church and the work of the administrative committee, which serves as the executive committee. So a smaller board, but hopefully more congregational delegates who can participate far more frequently than just every 2 years in a meeting where they may have had very little time to even consider what's on the docket and not so much time to really learn about what they're voting on. So learning, listening, growing together, more engagement, hearing from many more voices across the life of the church on a more regular basis. We hope that this will keep the general board in closer contact so that with our congregations, so that we can fully live into this covenantal life. Wherever the church is gathered, there is always congregation, region, and general expressions of the church. And if we can gather in this way, we can know each other better, understand what's on all of our hearts and minds in terms of issues, hopes, and dreams for the church. And we can act more effectively and more nimbly to allow the church to respond to those things. We're happy to welcome at this time the Reverend Allison Ruwari, who is a member of the General Board and serves on the Governance Committee and serves as an associate minister at Vine Street Christian Church in Nashville, Tennessee, and the moderator-elect of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in the U.S. and Canada, Elder Clyde Hunt, who is an elder at Mississippi Boulevard Christian Church in Memphis, Tennessee. Allison and Clyde are here because we've heard so many different questions as we've done the town halls, and they're going to ask the questions that we have been hearing so that you get a better understanding of what we've heard and what we're learning. And perhaps you have these same questions. So I'll turn it over to Allison and Clyde to get us going with our Q&A.
Thanks, Terry and Belva and Bill, for all of your work and the way you presented this. So Belva and Terry both mentioned that the recommendation for each congregation is to have 3 delegates. So my questions is why 3? What if my congregation is smaller and we're just holding it together and it's hard to find 3 to be engaged? And what if my congregation is bigger and really engaged and wants to have that kind of representation we had in the past?
Thank you for that, Allison. And we do know that there are smaller congregations where it's a struggle just to fill seats on your own congregational boards and church councils. So the idea is not to insist that you have 3 people, but to give you the opportunity to have 3 people. The number 3 was chosen for all sizes of congregations as a way to express parity, equal representation. That said, we do know that there are some larger churches who are interested in continuing to have more representation. This is still just a proposal. The General Board will review it, and the General Assembly will also review it. So if there is a sense from the church that we need to change those, we certainly can. But the idea was for parity, to increase the amount of participation by ensuring that people had not just 1 or 2, but 3 delegates who would serve 3-year terms. So not just going to General Assembly and then coming home, but being engaged on a continuous basis across the life of the church.
Thank you, Terry. So my question is, do these changes mean we're changing our identity or statement of faith?
No. In a word, this is what we're not doing. We are not, our identity statement, we are disciples of Christ, movement for wholeness in a fragmented world. As part of the one body of Christ, we welcome all to the Lord's table as God has welcomed us. That remains our identity statement. We are not changing anything in what we call the preamble, or what many congregations call the affirmation of faith. We still believe in Jesus. we still confess that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, and we're not making any changes to any theological understandings. Our philosophy and theology, even as a Christian church, is that we would never put anything into the design that's theological that someone might disagree with. And so you won't find a lot of formulations. For example, in the preamble, there is no statement of the Trinitarian doctrine because not all disciples agree on the idea of the Trinity. So we're not making any theological changes. These are all changes about the process by which we listen, learn, and make decisions together as a church. It's about our governance and our life together in covenant. It is not about what we believe.
Okay, thank you so much.
Got another voting question. So as a clergy person, I am automatically granted voting rights at every assembly. Does this affect my ability to vote? If so, how? How not?
All clergy will continue to have voting status. So if you're a pastor and your congregation has 3 voting delegates, you still will retain your voting status as a clergy. And that applies to anyone as a clergy, retired and otherwise, who would have had voting rights in our current system. You will continue to have those that voting status.
Okay, so if these changes are affirmed at the General Assembly in Louisville this summer, what's the timeline for implementation, or what are the next steps?
Well, one of the good pieces of feedback that we've received, and we all have understood on the committee, that we will need what I call a ramp-up period. So we're going to need a couple of years before this 3-year cycle goes into effect in order to think through all of the standing rules for both the General Board and the General Assembly, implementation about how we're going to have all these virtual meetings, looking at technology, better understanding staffing support that will be needed. And so our moderator, Belva Brown Jordan, is actually in the process of beginning to name an implementation team to begin to think about those issues and concerns. So we are putting that team together as we speak, and we will actually be creating other communication tools like this town hall video once the General Board has made its decision about whether or not this is an official resolution that will go to the General Assembly. You'll be seeing more media and communication tools to help educate the church about these particular changes. So in the new year, even before General Board, we'll continue to make these kinds of resources available so that we're all learning together. And by the time we get to Louisville, it's our goal that a good part of the church has been educated on what these changes are, so that we walk into that hall prepared to vote, having been educated and having had the opportunity to dialogue about some of these changes. And the information that's being shared on your screen about where you can provide input and feedback is so important. We really are modeling, I think, what we hope the new environment will look like, an ongoing conversation that we get to have about issues and concerns and ideas and dreams that matter to the church. I like to think of this not just about solving problems or grappling with difficult issues, but providing an opportunity for new ideas to come to the fore and to allow us to dream and imagine together.
Thank you.
So you've mentioned modeling a new way of being church, and we know that there are a lot of models for how to gather as a denomination. Why this one, and what models influence this vision?
Mm-hmm. I think one of the most important theological ideas that we've been guided by is the idea of covenant, and holding that as an aspirational value. We don't have a lot of levels of authority within our church, at least not directly. The general minister and president has a unique and somewhat strange a role in the church, a role of vision and strategy, but not necessarily directing the operations of a large part of the church. Each of our regions have their own executives, their own boards. Each of our general ministries have their own executives and their own boards. So we need to understand theologically this idea of covenant. And as part of covenant, we all have to understand, we all have to engage, we all have to commit, and we all have to be willing to participate. So that's the important theological understanding here. But I've had the opportunity on several different occasions to participate in the General Council of the United Church of Canada, which has a real strong culture around listening, dialogue, and preparing to make decisions. Small group conversations where the output of those conversations is then fed to a larger group that culls together all that information. They're able to feed it back to their general board and even ask the question, where do we agree? Where do we disagree? Are we even ready to vote or make a decision in this area? They have modeled listening sessions, learning sessions, where you listen to the originators of various resolutions, and you just get to ask clarifying questions. It's not a time for debate. It's simply a time to learn and ensure that you really understand what's being proposed. Then there are discussion sessions, and then there are decision sessions. So when we gather, it's not always going to be to have a knockout, drag out debate on the floor, on the virtual floor, right? It's going to be to share ideas, learn more, a wonderful way to educate ourselves on even what's happening across the life of the church. A lot of times we publish the Covenant Journal that comes out after General Board, and it's our attempt to try to let the church know what happened at General Board. But wow, what if we could have a live session where our moderators and other folks could share with our assembly delegates on an ongoing basis what's actually happening. So those are the things that have influenced my thinking about it. And Belva and Bill, if you have any other thoughts about this, but we've spent a lot of time talking about this theological understanding of covenant, which is what yielded that curriculum. And I think we've found that a lot of folks across the church aren't as educated even about how our current system works. And that education in the curriculum has helped really to give people a better understanding of who we are as disciples and how we understand our life together.
I think a part of our covenant understanding, too, is that we're a church that's continually growing and evolving and responding to changes that are happening in the culture and the religious landscape around us. And for that reason, we need to be more nimble. We need to be able to respond more quickly, but also more deliberately. The representatives to the general board are going to be invited not simply because they might represent some constituency, but rather because of the skill sets that they'll bring and the deep commitment they'll have to the well-being of the whole church, and not just my part or this person's part.
And in terms of other models, we are learning that some of our, at least one of our sister brother denominations is also moving to a 3-year cycle of meeting annually, so that it's not just every 2 years. And so we know that the United Church of Christ is also having these conversations about changing. So that's another. So in terms of models, this is a model in which others are also giving some consideration to, just as we are. So, yeah.
And I think it's also important to note that in the Mission First proposals, the changes that we're making to have a smaller, more nimbler general board were also part of those proposals as well. So again, these are lessons, as I said earlier, that we committed to learn what we could for Mission First and carry those things forward. So some of these ideas are things that the church has been talking about for a long time. And we hope that at this point we're able to move some of these ideas forward into implementation. But we do know it's going to take us a while to work out all the particular details and logistics. We will learn. We'll figure out that some things don't work quite the way we think they will, and we'll be nimble enough to make those changes and learn from our mistakes or our errors, and work through the implementation until it does work the way we want it to. As Bill said, we have a history and a legacy of continued renewal and structural reform. That those words are in our design, and that's what the governance committee was charged to ensure, that the church continued to review and reflect and change so that it can meet the needs of the world that we serve.
And as we consider making changes, I know many of us are aware that sometimes we can be overwhelmed by changes and not so sure about how we feel about moving one way or the other. And one of the things that this model will do, we hope, is provide more opportunities for disciples across the life of the whole church to build relationships of trust and mutual respect. One of the places where things break down is when we don't spend much time together. We don't really know each other. I'm sad to say, we don't always trust each other. And if we're going to be the church that we say we are, and if we're going to be the body of Christ, active and engaged in our communities right now, inspiring new disciples and equipping them, we're going to have to trust each other, and trust is going to happen as we build those relationships, strengthen and nurture those relationships. And this model gives us, I think, a better chance of that than some previous models we've had.
Amen.
So, if I'm a delegate for my congregation, what will it look like? How much time will it take, and what will I be responsible for doing?
Those are really good questions. And first of all, we know that all of these delegates, we want you to be praying. That you would be accountable to praying for the whole church, to pray for the leaders of the church, to pray that voices will be heard. We want you to participate in education about the issues as they arise, or about new proposals or new ideas as they arise. And we'll want you to participate in these digital and asynchronous. By asynchronous, we mean that not everybody would be in one big conversation together all of the time. If every congregation, we have a little over 3,000 congregations. If every congregation has 3 delegates, that's a little over 9,000 people. So we know that we're going to have to think about, are there clusters? Are there regional gatherings and groups? One of the ideas that I have that I think could increase volunteerism across the life of the church is that we would have, I don't know, captains or facilitators within our regions, not regional staff, but people who just care about the church and want to serve in volunteer leadership in the life of the church to help facilitate some of these conversations. So don't think about, I think what comes to mind is, are we going to have like 5 days of General Assembly online, like every year or 2 or 3 times a year? That's not what we're thinking at all. We're talking, focus groups, 1 or 2 hour kinds of conversations or education that might happen certainly at least once a year, but they might happen quarterly. They may not happen more frequently than that. And I think that's something that we'll have to think through together and figure out. It's also a situation where the moderator of the church could certainly call the assembly into session to hear or discuss a particular matter. So don't think about it as replicating the in-person experience online. These are going to be much crisper, more concise, relatively infrequent kinds of conversations, but they can be as frequent as they need to be. And we certainly understand the challenges in some parts of the U.S. and Canada where broadband is an issue. The committee has talked about, what if a congregation that did have strong Wi-Fi, for example, could host other groups to come and listen in on the conversation? Your whole congregation can participate in these sessions. It's just that you'll be limited to 3 voting delegates per congregation. So my hope, and I think all of our hope, is that as much of the church as can would certainly participate in the listening and the learning, and even being present when votes are taken, recognizing that you are limited to a certain number of votes per congregation. So we're not trying to make this an onerous process at all. And we know that the technology, think of what's happened with technology since the pandemic in early 2020. We know that that will continue to be more affordable and more effective. And we'll need to have someone really paying attention to the evolution of that technology so that we can make those connections easier and more accessible. Well, I think that may be all of the questions that we have for today, or at least those questions reflect the majority of what we've been hearing. We will invite you to look at the website, and that information is going to be on your screen, where we have a wonderful overview as well as several frequently asked questions. And if you have a question or further feedback, you can always email covenant@disciples.org. We want to hear from you between now and certainly now in General Board in April of 2023. And then after that, you'll be looking at the full proposal as it goes as a resolution to the General Board. But Belva and Bill, I'll turn it back to you to close us out.
I'd just like to say thank you, everyone, for participating in this town hall. And to those of you who are seeing this town hall, you're now joining literally hundreds of other disciples who have provided the kind of feedback that's really helped us to better shape this proposal as it goes along. So on behalf of the committee, thank you so much for your participation. And Belva, thank you for your leadership.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Yes, I'd like to add my voice of thanks as one representing your moderator team, along with our moderator-elect, Clyde Hunt. We really are deeply grateful for the number of people who have participated in this process and are so excited to see what is going to happen when we come together in Louisville in 2023. So thank you all for viewing this town hall, for sending your questions, for praying for us and praying with us as we participate in the covenant of being together in this church. Thank you so much.